Hello, the topic is climate illusionists. And let me read the description for you. Climate illusionists addressing climate change will not save the planet. Building out solar arrays does nothing for rapidly declining wildlife populations. In fact, solar arrays and wind farms take much more materials, for example, metals, and more land per unit of energy than do fossil fuels. And yet, addressing climate change is supposed to save the planet for reasons that are not fully explained. Now, I'm all for reducing fossil fuels, but what we can't do is keep on growing our energy consumption and just switch over to another form of energy. These alternative forms of energy like solar and wind, they're not reliable or steady. They take much more land than we are led to believe. They take much more materials than we are led to believe. And there's no reason, there's no law that says we have to continue growing the economy. We have to continue growing our energy consumption. Those two things are correlated. The economy and our energy consumption are correlated with one another. The rate at which we extract materials are correlated with one another. So if you're growing the economy at 2.5% per year, then the economy doubles every 30 years. And the energy consumption doubles every 30 years, and the materials extraction doubles every 30 years. And so, we're just solving for the wrong variable. Most of the climate coverage that we get is just not reliable at all. It's completely misleading, in fact. But let's get into this article. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do it by clicking on this button. This is an article that was in The Intercept in 2022. It's still very timely. It's written by Christopher Ketchum. Christopher wrote a very good book that I don't agree with all of it, but it's a very good book. It's called This Land: How Capitalism, Corruption, and Cowboys Are Ruining the American West. And this is an article in The Intercept. And the article, let me get myself situated here. The article, the subtitle is "The Dismal Reality is that Green Energy will save not the complex web of life on Earth, but the particular way of life of one domineering species." We need to separate those two things. We need to decide, are we going to save life on Earth, or are we just going to try to save the lifestyle of the few, of the lifestyle of people? And those are two different things. For one thing, it's one thing to say we're going to save life on this planet. It's quite another thing to say we're going to save civilization. But even then, solar and wind are not going to support the civilization that people have in mind. So anyway, let's go on with the article. The dismal reality, I'm going to be quoting from the article. The dismal reality is that green energy will save not the complex web of life on Earth, but the particular way of life of one domineering species. Conservation biology. Now, this is referring to an article that was written by conservation biologists. Conservation biologists are wildlife biologists. They're ones that measure wildlife populations, and we should be relying on them to tell us the true status of wildlife and how to save wildlife. Unfortunately, they've gotten themselves into a situation where they're kind of going with the flow of the climate change narrative, which in my view is a false narrative. But it says, conservation biology finds itself in a terrifying place today, witness to mass extinction, helpless to stop the march of industrial Homo sapiens, the pillage of habitat, the loss of wildlands, and the impoverishment of ecosystems. This is Dan Ash, Director of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm 40 years into conservation biology, and I can tell you we are losing badly, getting our asses kicked. Dan Ash, director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under President Barack Obama, told me recently. There are almost no reasons to be optimistic. This might explain the discipline's desperate hitching of its wagon to the climate movement. Climate, after all, is the environmental cause du jour, eclipsing all other sustainability concerns, increasingly attractive as a rallying cry for a public that has canonized it as one of the major social, political, and economic issues of our time. So, anyway, I'm here to tell you, I've been reporting on climate change for 7 years now. And I started off with a kind of a very mainstream understanding of what it would take to save the climate and how that relates to the rest of the biosphere, the rest of the natural world. And I have come to a very different place as to what are the causes of climate change and what are the solutions to climate change. And so the causes, in my view, have much more to do with what we are doing to the land. When the sun shines on a piece of bare ground, it gets much hotter than when it shines on plants. If the sun shines on plants, those plants are solar-powered air conditioners. They transpire water. They cause water to evaporate. And in so doing, they create a lot of cooling. Evaporation has a cooling effect. And that's what happens when the sun shines on plants, because plants, by their nature, they're sucking water in through the roots, up through the trunk, out through the leaves, causing evaporation. It has a cooling effect, just like when we step out of the shower or out of the pool. It has a cooling effect just as it would when we sweat. When we exercise or it's a hot day, we sweat because that cools us off. And trees and plants have the same mechanism. They cause water to exude from their pores, and they cause that water to evaporate. Evaporating water has a cooling effect. That has a much more dramatic effect on temperatures than mere greenhouse gases. Not like it's an either or. We can, seek to lower greenhouse gases and at the same time cover more of the ground with plants and trees, cover crops, landscape plants, rather than having everything bare dirt, pavement, sand. So that is my understanding of how we could rapidly and in a way that it's safe and clean, cool our environment. We could do it that way, but instead there's this total emphasis on greenhouse gases that, in my view, is entirely misguided. Meanwhile, the covering the ground with plants, as I suggested, would have a dramatic positive effect on wildlife. Wildlife populations are rapidly declining. Say hi to the train. Wildlife populations are rapidly declining. It's unfortunate, with all this emphasis on greenhouse gases, we could help our wildlife populations by allowing some of the vegetation to go back. We've eliminated about half of the vegetation that used to exist in the last, according to Canadian scientist Václav Smil, we've eliminated about half of the plant matter, half of the coverage of plants in the last 5,000 years. If we've eliminated half, then we could cause that to go back in the opposite direction by growing and increasing our plant matter. The sun, the soil, and the rain will do most of the work. The plants, the animals, and the fungi will do most of the work if we will allow that plant matter to grow back by giving it space. That is the way to solve climate change, and not all of this hyper focus on greenhouse gases, as if solar panels and wind turbines are going to lower carbon emissions. They're not going to do that. But I digress. Let's get back to the article. So mainstream climate activism of the Bill McKibben variety points toward a grandly hopeful end within the confines of acceptable capitalist discourse. decarbonization of the global economy with technologies driven by profit-seeking corporations subsidized by governments. So the key phrase here is within the confines of acceptable capitalist discourse. In other words, we're going to rely on business, we're going to rely on markets to sell us enough solar panels and sell us enough wind turbines and sell us enough electric cars so that this somehow solves the climate crisis. This somehow lowers the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I don't see it happening. As long as the economy is growing, as long as our energy consumption is doubling every 25 or 30 years, as long as our economy is doubling every 25 or 30 years, as long as our extraction of materials is doubling every 25 or 30 years, show me that scenario. Show me a scenario where the economy is doubling every 25 or 30 years, and at the same time we're lowering carbon emissions. Even if we were to lower carbon emissions per unit, per dollar, lower carbon emissions per unit of energy. If that were possible, I don't think even that is possible, but if it were possible, you cut carbon emissions per unit of energy in half, but then you double the units of energy, and you're right back to where you started from. Let's go back to the article. So taking up this banner of optimistic can-doism, the environmental movement has convinced itself and sought to convince the public that the worldwide build-out of renewable energy systems, humanity will power its dynamic industrial civilization with jobs-producing green machines, while also somehow rescuing countless species from the brink. The emphasis on the word somehow. When they say somehow, they're saying, what is the connection between this worldwide build out of so-called renewable energy and supposedly rescuing species from the brink? We'll get into this in a minute, but the World Wildlife Fund every 2 years measures the decline of monitored vertebrate populations. And when they do that, it's like in the last, let's see, the report came out in 2024 and said that since 1970, there has been a 73% decline in monitored vertebrate populations. 73% decline. That would seem to be, when you have a 73% decline in 54 years, that would seem to be a number that is rapidly approaching zero. How is that not the environmental issue of our time? How is it that a rise in temperatures becomes the environmental issue of our time? Not that it's not important, not that we shouldn't address it. We can address it, but if we address temperatures without addressing the other causes of a 73% decline in wildlife in the last 54 years, then what are we gaining? So, but this happens to be a lie. The lie that he's talking about is the idea that we're going to build out all this renewable energy while also rescuing species from the brink somehow. But this happens to be a lie, Ash told me. The lie is that if we address the climate crisis, we will also solve the biodiversity crisis. The lie is that if we address the climate crisis, we will also solve the biodiversity crisis. Where is the evidence for that? Where is the evidence that by building out solar and wind, we're somehow going to address the biodiversity crisis? This is also a question in terms of, if you build out solar and wind, it takes a lot of land. You have to, people are cutting down forests. People are, taking up a lot of land and you see articles from time to time about how, we're going to build pollinator gardens under this, or we're going to graze livestock under this. Okay, fine, but you're still taking up a lot of space with those solar panels, and there's, space is finite. Can you build out and plus the infrastructure that it takes to support so-called renewable energy is massive. The power lines, and then you build out these power lines. It takes a whole lot more power lines. It takes a whole lot more copper, and it takes a whole lot more steel and concrete, all these building materials that are required to build out the infrastructure that it takes to support so-called renewable energy. And that displaces wildlife. That removes wildlife habitat. That gets in the way of plants, and plants, you can't have wildlife habitat on land without plants. So anyway, a group of conservationists took up the question of climate and extinctions last year in the Journal of Conservation Letters, warning that threats to biodiversity are increasingly seen through the single myopic lens of climate change. They call the climate change a myopic lens because it's short-sighted, because climate change itself in the short term is not a big burden to wildlife, not nearly as much as the other things. Let's see what some of those other things are. So what's destroying species today is habitat fragmentation and loss, overhunting and overexploitation, not least of all overfishing. You have these, virtually unaccountable fishing vessels, industrial fishing vessels on the sea. Okay, overhunting, overexploitation, agricultural expansion, pollution, and industrial development. It isn't climate change that caused a 69% loss in total wildlife populations between 1970 and 2018, according to a World Wildlife Fund study published this year. The cause is too many people demanding too much from ecosystems or human overshoot of the biophysical carrying capacity of the earth. Okay, so they say too many people. I take issue with that. I think it's not so much how many people there are as what we do. We could much more readily and much more quickly change what we do than we can change how many we are. According to the co-authors of the Conservation Letters piece, we are dangerously ignoring this reality instead of doubling down on the distortion that climate mitigation is all that matters to protecting wildlife. The net result of this misguided focus on climate change has been the undermining of conservation science as an evidence-based scientific discipline. So what they're saying there is that conservation science or conservation biology, which are, these are the people that do the statistical measurements of wildlife. And these are the people who opine as to the causes of wildlife declines in any particular place. And if they're jumping on the bandwagon that says wildlife decline is because of climate change, then they're doing that. You have to ignore the evidence that says wildlife decline is because of climate change. So they are departing from their science and going into a kind of rhetoric and analysis that's popular, but it's not evidence-based. So, as Dobson put it to me, if conservation biologists don't take a balanced look at the evidence, they can't claim to be evidence-based. The crux of the problem is that mainstream environmentalists have siloed climate change as a phenomenon apart from the broad ecological footprint, separate from deforestation, overgrazing of livestock, megafauna kill-off, collapsing fisheries, desertification, depleted freshwater, soil degradation, oceanic garbage gyres, toxification of rainfall with microplastics, and on and on. The myriad biospheric effects of breakneck growth. So I could stop there, and that is the last slide. But let's look at these. These are the things that cause the rapid decline of wildlife. The deforestation, somewhere between 50 and 80, probably close to 80% of species are in forests. So when we deforest, remember I said you can't have wildlife habitat without plants, including trees. When you eliminate the forest, then you've got a problem. So deforestation, overgrazing of livestock, that one is misunderstood, but yes, overgrazing can be a problem, but that's a whole other conversation. Megafauna kill-off, collapsing fisheries, desertification, depleted freshwater, not only depleted freshwater in the soil. There was a major article about that recently. Soil degradation, oceanic garbage gyres, toxification of rainfall with microplastics, and on and on, the myriad biospheric effects of breakneck growth. So there you have it. Those are the things that cause the rapid decline of wildlife. And we are fooling ourselves, fooling each other, and doing a grave disservice to the planet and a grave disservice to our movement by insisting that climate change is the cause of species loss, the cause of biodiversity loss. So that's about all I have. I'm going to have another video on the article that they're referring to, the article in Conservation Letters. So look out for that one. Thank you for joining me. Have a great day.